In the summer of 1985, a commercial airline pilot walked away from his life with nearly $4 million and vanished without a trace. No distress signals, no ransom demands, no second chances. The investigation stalled within months, the money disappeared into thin air, and the silence stretched on for over 2 decades. But in 2011, during the routine clearing of a forgotten storage facility in Detroit, workers stumbled upon a weathered leather briefcase that had been sitting untouched since the Reagan administration. Inside wasn't cash, but something that would crack open a case the FBI had long considered unsolvable. What they found was a single passport, faded and water-stained, bearing the photograph of a man who had supposedly died in 1985. The discovery would unravel one of the most meticulously planned financial crimes in aviation history and expose a network of deception that had remained buried for 26 years. On the morning of June 18, 1985, Captain Elijah Paul arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport for what appeared to be a routine cargo flight. Paul, a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience, was scheduled to transport a shipment of high-value electronics and cash deposits from 3 regional banks to a secure facility in Miami. The cargo manifest listed the total value at $3.9 million, mostly in bundled currency and negotiable securities. It was the kind of run Paul had completed dozens of times before, methodical and unremarkable. Paul checked in with ground operations at 6:20 a.m., completed his pre-flight inspection and filed his flight plan without incident. The aircraft, a modified Boeing 727, configured specifically for secure transport, had been loaded under federal supervision. 2 armed security guards accompanied the cargo, both employed by a bonded courier service with an impeccable track record. Everything proceeded according to established protocol. At 7:45 a.m., Flight 447 departed Chicago on schedule. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and air traffic control logged routine communications with Paul as the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. For the next hour and 17 minutes, everything appeared normal. Paul maintained radio contact, reported his position at scheduled intervals, and gave no indication of distress or mechanical difficulty. Then, at exactly 9:02 a.m., while flying over rural Tennessee, Flight 437 simply disappeared from radar. The last transmission from Paul was calm and professional. He acknowledged a routine altitude clearance from Memphis Center, confirmed his position, and signed off with his call sign. There was no emergency declaration, no mention of equipment failure, and no request for assistance. The aircraft vanished from air traffic control screens as if it had never existed. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Search and rescue operations began within minutes of the radar loss. The Federal Aviation Administration coordinated with the Tennessee Air National Guard to deploy aircraft over the suspected crash zone, while ground teams prepared to mobilize across a search area spanning 3 counties. Weather conditions remained favorable, and visibility was excellent. If the aircraft had gone down, debris should have been easily spotted from the air. But after 48 hours of intensive searching, no wreckage was found. No debris field, no impact crater, no distress beacon signal. It was as if the Boeing 727 had been erased from the sky. The search area was expanded, then expanded again, eventually covering over 2,000 square miles of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama countryside. Satellite imagery was reviewed, radar data was analyzed frame by frame, and every possible flight path was mapped and retraced. The investigation took an unexpected turn on the 3rd day when a farmer in rural Kentucky contacted authorities about an aircraft he had observed landing in a remote field near his property. The farmer, whose property bordered an abandoned airstrip that had been used for crop dusting in the 1960s, reported seeing a large commercial aircraft touch down around 9:15 a.m. on the morning of June 18th. He had assumed it was an emergency landing and expected to see emergency vehicles arrive shortly afterward. When none came, he drove to the airstrip to investigate. The field was empty. No aircraft, no tire marks in the grass, no signs that anything had landed there. The farmer insisted he had seen a plane, but with no physical evidence to support his account, investigators initially dismissed the report as mistaken identity. However, the timing of his observation coincided almost perfectly with Flight 447's disappearance from radar, and the location was within the aircraft's possible range given its last known position. A forensic team was dispatched to examine the airstrip. What they discovered changed everything. Hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt and grass clippings were fresh tire impressions, consistent with the landing gear of a Boeing 727. Fuel stains were detected in the soil, and chemical analysis confirmed the presence of Jet A aviation fuel. Most significantly, investigators found evidence that the grass had been recently cut and scattered to conceal the tire marks, indicating deliberate camouflage rather than natural weathering. The airstrip itself had an interesting history. Built in 1963 by a local agricultural company, it had been used for crop dusting operations until 1978, when the business ceased operations and the property was abandoned. County records showed that ownership had transferred several times over the years, eventually landing with a shell company based in Delaware. The company had no employees, no business operations, and no traceable assets beyond the Tennessee property. Its incorporation papers listed a post office box as the primary address, and the registered agent had no knowledge of who had actually established the entity. Further investigation revealed that property taxes on the airstrip had been paid consistently and in advance through a series of intermediary payments, always in cash, always through different law firms. The pattern suggested someone had been maintaining control of the property for years while carefully obscuring their identity. Most tellingly, the last tax payment had been made just 3 months before Flight 447's disappearance, covering the next 5 years in full. The 2 security guards who had been aboard the aircraft were identified as Marcus Thompson and David Hayes, both employed by Consolidated Security Services, a Chicago-based firm specializing in high-value transport. Thompson had worked for the company for 8 years and had an exemplary record. Hayes was newer to the job, having been hired just 6 months earlier, but his background check had revealed no red flags. Both men lived modest lifestyles consistent with their salaries and had no known financial difficulties. However, when investigators attempted to contact the men's families, they discovered something disturbing. Neither Thompson nor Hayes had any family members who could be located. The addresses listed in their employment files led to vacant apartments. The emergency contacts provided were disconnected phone numbers, and the references given during their hiring process either didn't exist or had no recollection of the men. It appeared that both security guards had been living under carefully constructed false identities. The realization that the security guards were not who they claimed to be transformed the investigation from a potential accident into a confirmed criminal case. The FBI took over the investigation, classifying it as aircraft theft, kidnapping, and federal money laundering. Special agents began working backward through the guards' fabricated histories, attempting to determine their real identities and uncover how they had managed to infiltrate a bonded security company. Consolidated Security Services cooperated fully with the investigation, providing personnel files, background check documentation, and employment records. The company's hiring procedures appeared thorough and professional, including fingerprint verification, credit checks, and criminal history searches. Yet somehow, 2 individuals with completely fabricated identities had passed through their screening process and gained access to millions of dollars in transported assets. The breakthrough came when FBI forensics experts analyzed the fingerprints on file for both guards. While the prints had been used to verify clean criminal records during the hiring process, they had never been cross-referenced against federal databases maintained by other agencies. When the prints were run through the military personnel database, both men were identified immediately. Marcus Thompson was actually Sergeant Anthony Williams, a former Army logistics specialist who had been dishonorably discharged in 1983 following a court-martial for theft of military property. David Hayes was Master Sergeant Jerome Foster, a decorated military police officer who had disappeared from his base in Germany in 1984 while under investigation for suspected involvement in a black market operation. Both men had extensive military training in security procedures, cargo handling, and tactical operations. Foster, in particular, had specialized training in aircraft operations and had served as an air transport coordinator during his military career. Their combined expertise would have made them uniquely qualified to execute a sophisticated heist involving commercial aviation. The military records also revealed something else significant. Both Williams and Foster had served together at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, just 40 miles from the abandoned airstrip where Flight 447 had apparently landed. They would have been familiar with the local geography and would have had opportunities to scout potential landing sites during their time stationed in the area. As the investigation deepened, a pattern began to emerge. This was not a crime of opportunity or desperation. It was a carefully orchestrated operation that had been planned for months, possibly years. The fake identities, the infiltration of the security company, the acquisition of the remote airstrip, and the timing of the heist all pointed to a level of sophistication that suggested professional criminal expertise. But the most puzzling aspect of the case remained unsolved. What had happened to Captain Elijah Paul? Was he a victim who had been overpowered and murdered by the fake security guards? Or was he somehow complicit in the theft, a willing participant who had helped orchestrate his own disappearance? The answer to that question would remain buried for 26 years, hidden in a storage locker in Detroit, waiting for the right moment to surface and expose the truth behind one of the most elaborate financial crimes in aviation history. The investigation into Captain Elijah Paul's background revealed a man whose life appeared ordinary on the surface, but contained subtle inconsistencies that investigators had initially overlooked. Paul lived alone in a modest apartment in Cicero, Illinois, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and maintained a checking account with a balance that rarely exceeded $3,000. His neighbors described him as quiet but friendly, a man who kept regular hours and rarely had visitors. On paper, he was the picture of middle-class stability, but deeper scrutiny exposed cracks in that facade. Paul's employment record showed he had worked for regional air transport for only 18 months, despite claiming over 15 years of commercial flying experience. When investigators attempted to verify his previous employment with other airlines, they encountered a series of dead ends. Companies had gone out of business, personnel files had been destroyed in fires or floods, and former supervisors had died or moved without leaving forwarding addresses. The pattern was too convenient to be coincidental. Financial records painted an even more suspicious picture. While Paul's checking account appeared modest, investigators discovered he had been making regular cash deposits into a safety deposit box at a downtown Chicago bank. The deposits, always in amounts under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements, had been occurring monthly for over 2 years. Bank surveillance footage showed Paul visiting the facility on the same day each month, always carrying a small canvas bag, always alone. When federal agents obtained a warrant to open the safety deposit box, they found it empty except for a single key and a handwritten note containing what appeared to be geographic coordinates. The key was traced to another safety deposit box at a different bank, which contained $23,000 in cash, 3 sets of identification documents bearing Paul's photograph but different names, and detailed maps of several remote airstrips across the southeastern United States. The abandoned Kentucky airstrip where Flight 447 had apparently landed was circled in red ink. The fake identification documents were sophisticated forgeries that would have cost significant money to produce. Each set included driver's licenses, Social Security cards, and birth certificates for different states. The names were variations on Paul's real name, suggesting he had been building multiple identities while maintaining enough similarity to avoid confusion during high-stress situations. One set of documents listed his occupation as aircraft mechanic, another as flight instructor, and the third as cargo transport coordinator. FBI handwriting experts analyzed the note containing the coordinates and compared it to samples of Paul's signature from employment documents and flight logs. The analysis confirmed that Paul had written the note himself, likely within days of the heist based on the ink aging characteristics. The coordinates led to a location in rural Alabama, approximately 200 miles south of the Kentucky landing site, and within the range of the stolen aircraft's fuel capacity. A team of federal agents and Alabama State Police converged on the coordinates, which pointed to a heavily wooded area near a defunct logging road. Ground-penetrating radar detected metal objects buried beneath 3 feet of soil and decomposed leaves. Excavation revealed the aircraft's black box flight data recorder, its emergency locator beacon, and several pieces of avionics equipment that had been deliberately removed from Flight 447 and buried separately. The flight data recorder provided crucial evidence about the aircraft's final moments in the air. Analysis showed that the plane had descended rapidly from cruising altitude beginning at 9:01 a.m., just 60 seconds before it disappeared from radar. The descent was controlled and deliberate, not the chaotic plunge of an aircraft in distress. Paul had executed a textbook emergency landing procedure, shutting down non-essential systems and configuring the aircraft for an unpowered approach to minimize noise and radar signature. More significantly, the cockpit voice recorder captured conversations between Paul and the 2 fake security guards during the final minutes of the flight. The audio quality was poor due to water damage, but forensic enhancement revealed enough dialogue to reconstruct what had happened. Paul was not a victim. He was the mastermind. The recordings revealed Paul instructing Williams and Foster on their roles once the aircraft landed. He discussed timing, escape routes, and contingency plans with the familiarity of someone who had rehearsed every detail. Most damning was the exchange in which Paul reminded the others that their military training made them invaluable assets, and that their share of the proceeds would set them up for life. There was no coercion, no threats of violence. This was a partnership built on mutual greed and careful planning. The buried avionics equipment told another part of the story. Paul had systematically disabled the aircraft's tracking and communication systems in a specific sequence designed to create the appearance of sudden catastrophic failure. The emergency locator beacon had been removed and deactivated before the landing, ensuring that search and rescue teams would find no electronic trail leading to the aircraft's actual location. Even the transponder had been modified with a timer circuit that would shut it down at a predetermined moment, creating the illusion of instantaneous destruction. But the most revealing discovery was a waterproof container buried alongside the aircraft components. Inside was a detailed timeline of the operation, written in Paul's handwriting and dated 3 days before the heist. The document outlined every phase of the plan, from the initial infiltration of Consolidated Security Services to the final disposal of evidence. It read like a military operation order, complete with primary and alternate scenarios, communication protocols, and exfiltration procedures. The timeline revealed that Paul had been planning the theft for over 3 years. He had spent months researching security transport procedures, studying flight patterns, and identifying vulnerabilities in the cargo handling system. He had personally recruited Williams and Foster based on their military backgrounds and their desperation following their respective discharges from service. The abandoned Kentucky airstrip had been acquired through a series of shell companies specifically for this operation, with Paul providing the funding through his carefully accumulated cash reserves. The plan called for the aircraft to land at the Kentucky site, where a ground team would be waiting to transfer the cargo to trucks. Paul and the two guards would then fly the empty aircraft to a second location in Alabama, where it would be abandoned and partially destroyed to eliminate evidence. The three men would then separate permanently, each taking their share of the money and disappearing into carefully prepared new identities. According to the timeline, Paul's share was to be $1.5 million, with Williams and Foster each receiving $1.2 million. The remaining money was allocated to operational expenses, including payoffs to corrupt officials, purchase of equipment, and funding for their new identities. Paul had calculated that $1.5 million, properly managed and invested conservatively, would provide him with a comfortable lifestyle for the rest of his life without the need to work or maintain any traceable income source. The document also contained backup plans for various contingencies. If the aircraft was intercepted before landing, Paul would claim the guards had hijacked the plane and forced him to fly to the alternate location. If ground teams failed to appear at the Kentucky site, the aircraft would proceed directly to Alabama, where the cargo would be buried for later retrieval. If any member of the team was captured, they were instructed to claim they had been recruited by an unknown third party and had no knowledge of the overall plan. But for all its meticulous planning, the operation contained one fatal flaw. Paul had underestimated the persistence of federal investigators and the advances in forensic technology that would occur over the following decades. Evidence that seemed permanently buried in 1985 would eventually surface through coincidence, technological advancement, and the simple passage of time. The discovery of the flight data recorder and Paul's written plans provided federal prosecutors with enough evidence to file charges in absentia. Paul was indicted on multiple federal counts, including aircraft theft, money laundering, conspiracy, and kidnapping. Williams and Foster were charged as co-conspirators, though their current whereabouts remained unknown. The case was officially reclassified from missing persons to active federal fugitive investigation. But even with this breakthrough, crucial questions remained unanswered. Where was the $3.9 million in stolen money? What had happened to the three conspirators after they separated in Alabama? Had they successfully disappeared into new lives, or had something gone wrong with their carefully planned escape? The answers to those questions lay hidden in a storage facility in Detroit, waiting to be discovered 26 years later by workers who had no idea they were about to solve one of the FBI's most enduring mysteries. The breakthrough that would finally crack the case came not from advanced forensic techniques or tireless detective work, but from the mundane reality of unpaid storage fees and a city's need to clear abandoned property. In March 2011, the Detroit Public Storage Authority initiated proceedings to auction off the contents of over 200 storage units, whose rental fees had gone unpaid for more than 5 years. Most contained the typical detritus of interrupted lives, furniture, old appliances, boxes of photographs and documents that had outlived their owner's ability to pay for their safekeeping. Unit 247 had been rented in August 1987 under the name Marcus Williams, with rent paid in advance for 2 years. After that initial period expired, no further payments were made, but bureaucratic inefficiency and changes in ownership had allowed the unit to remain sealed for nearly 2 decades. The rental agreement listed a Detroit address that had long since been demolished for urban renewal, and the phone number had been disconnected for over 15 years. The contents appeared unremarkable at first glance. A few pieces of modest furniture, several cardboard boxes containing men's clothing, and a collection of automotive magazines dating from the late 1980s. But buried beneath a stack of old newspapers, wrapped in plastic sheeting and secured with duct tape, was a leather briefcase that had clearly been placed there with care rather than abandoned in haste. The briefcase bore the initials A to W embossed in faded gold lettering on the front flap. Inside, separated by tissue paper and sealed in individual plastic bags, were documents that would transform the cold case investigation into an active manhunt. The most significant item was a United States passport issued to Anthony Marcus Williams in 1986, bearing the photograph of the man investigators knew as Marcus Thompson, one of the fake security guards from Flight 437. The passport contained stamps from multiple countries, creating a trail of international travel that began just months after the heist. Williams had entered Canada through Detroit in September 1985, then traveled to the United Kingdom, France, and eventually to several Caribbean islands, known for their banking privacy laws. The stamps told the story of a man systematically moving money through international channels, using legitimate travel documents to facilitate what was almost certainly an elaborate money laundering operation. But the passport was not the only revelation in the briefcase. A spiral notebook contained detailed financial records written in Williams' handwriting, documenting the conversion of stolen cash into foreign currency, precious metals, and offshore bank accounts. The entries were methodical and precise, showing deposits made in increments designed to avoid detection by international banking authorities. Over the course of 18 months following the heist, Williams had moved nearly $1.2 million through banks in 7 different countries. The notebook also contained addresses and phone numbers for currency exchange houses, precious metals dealers, and what appeared to be money brokers operating in various Caribbean nations. Each entry was coded with letters and numbers that suggested Williams had developed a systematic approach to laundering the stolen funds. Some entries included notations about conversion rates, transaction fees, and timing considerations that revealed a sophisticated understanding of international finance. Most intriguingly, the notebook contained several references to meetings with individuals identified only by initials. EP appeared frequently in entries dated between late 1985 and early 1987, usually in connection with large cash transactions or discussions about investment strategies. JF appeared less frequently, but was associated with entries related to document procurement and travel arrangements. The pattern strongly suggested that Williams had maintained contact with his co-conspirators for at least 2 years after their initial separation. A separate section of the notebook contained what appeared to be contingency plans for various scenarios. Williams had outlined procedures for emergency communication, emergency relocation, and emergency liquidation of assets. He had identified safe houses in 3 different countries, established code words for different types of threats, and maintained detailed information about corrupt officials who could be bribed to provide assistance if legal problems arose. The final section of the notebook was the most revealing. It contained a detailed accounting of expenses related to maintaining his false identity. Williams had spent thousands of dollars on forged documents, safe deposit box rentals, mail forwarding services, and payments to individuals who provided various forms of identity protection. The entries showed that maintaining a completely fabricated identity required constant vigilance and significant ongoing financial investment. Among the other items in the briefcase were photographs that provided visual evidence of Williams's post-heist activities. Several showed him in tropical locations, dressed casually and appearing relaxed, suggesting he had successfully established a new life using his share of the stolen money. Other photographs showed him with unidentified individuals in what appeared to be business settings, possibly documenting meetings with the money brokers and document forgers referenced in his notebook. One photograph was particularly significant. It showed Williams standing next to a small aircraft on what appeared to be a private airstrip, with palm trees and tropical vegetation visible in the background. Written on the back in Williams' handwriting was the date October 1986 and the notation, "New Business Opportunities." The image suggested that Williams had used his aviation connections to establish some form of legitimate business as a cover for his illegal activities. The briefcase also contained a collection of newspaper clippings related to the Flight 447 investigation. Williams had apparently monitored media coverage of the case closely, collecting articles about search efforts, investigative developments, and official statements from federal authorities. Several articles were heavily annotated with his handwritten comments, revealing his perspective on the investigation's progress and his assessment of various law enforcement theories about what had happened. One clipping from a Chicago Tribune article dated March 1986 contained a particularly telling annotation. The article discussed the FBI's theory that the aircraft had crashed in a remote area and that the crew and cargo had been destroyed on impact. Williams had written in the margin, "They still don't understand what really happened. Good." The comment provided insight into his mindset and confirmed that he was aware his deception had been successful, at least in the short term. The discovery of Williams' briefcase prompted an immediate reopening of the Flight 447 investigation. FBI agents who had worked the original case were brought out of retirement to review the new evidence and provide historical context. The passport and notebook were subjected to forensic analysis to confirm their authenticity and extract any additional information that might have been overlooked during the initial examination. Handwriting experts confirmed that the notebook entries were consistent with other samples of Williams' handwriting obtained during the original investigation. Fingerprint analysis of the briefcase and its contents yielded multiple prints that matched those on file for both Williams and Jerome Foster, confirming that the two conspirators had maintained contact and had likely worked together to organize their post-heist activities. The international travel documented in Williams' passport provided investigators with specific leads to pursue. Working with Interpol and various national police agencies, FBI agents began tracing Williams' movements through the countries he had visited. Bank records were subpoenaed, hotel registrations were reviewed, and surveillance footage from airports and border crossings was analyzed in an attempt to reconstruct his activities during the critical months following the heist. The investigation revealed that Williams had been remarkably successful in laundering his share of the stolen money. Bank records from the Cayman Islands showed that he had established accounts under multiple names, all supported by the same forged documents found in his briefcase. Over the course of 2 years, he had systematically converted cash into investments in legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, and precious metals that could be easily transported and converted back to currency when needed. But the trail went cold in early 1987. Williams' passport showed no stamps after February of that year, and financial records indicated that his offshore accounts had been closed and their contents transferred to unknown destinations. It appeared that he had recognized the risks of maintaining a documented presence in the international banking system and had taken steps to disappear even more completely than before. The question that haunted investigators was whether Williams' disappearance in 1987 was voluntary, or whether something had happened to him. The careful preservation of his briefcase suggested he had intended to retrieve it eventually, but the fact that it had remained unclaimed for over 20 years raised the possibility that he had died or been killed before he could return to Detroit. The notebook's references to meetings with EP and JF took on new significance in light of this possibility. If Williams had maintained contact with Paul and Foster after their initial separation, it was possible that conflicts had arisen over money, territorial disputes, or concerns about security. Criminal partnerships built on mutual greed rarely ended peacefully, and the enormous sum of money involved would have provided ample motivation for betrayal or violence. FBI behavioral analysts developed a profile suggesting that Williams had likely been killed by one or both of his co-conspirators sometime in early 1987. The timing coincided with his disappearance from documented financial activity, and the preservation of his briefcase suggested he had been preparing for either an extended absence or a permanent relocation when his plans were interrupted. The fact that nearly $1.2 million in laundered assets had apparently vanished, along with Williams, suggested that whoever killed him had also gained access to his hidden wealth. The discovery of Anthony Williams' briefcase in that forgotten Detroit storage unit finally provided the missing pieces to a puzzle that had confounded investigators for over 2 decades. What began as a routine aircraft disappearance had evolved into one of the most sophisticated financial crimes in aviation history, orchestrated by men who understood that the perfect crime wasn't about avoiding detection, but about making detection irrelevant. Captain Elijah Paul had crafted a plan so intricate that even when evidence surfaced years later, it only served to highlight the brilliance of his deception. He had transformed a simple cargo theft into an elaborate performance, complete with false identities, manufactured alibis, and contingency plans that anticipated every possible investigative avenue. The $3.9 million had not simply been stolen. It had been systematically laundered through international channels and converted into assets that could never be traced back to their criminal origins. Yet, for all their careful planning, the 3 conspirators had fallen victim to the one variable they could not control: time itself. The passage of decades had exposed their carefully constructed facades, turning their greatest strength into their ultimate weakness. Documents they thought were safely hidden had surfaced through bureaucratic oversight. Technology they had never anticipated made their old deception suddenly transparent, and the very systems they had used to disappear had evolved to make disappearance impossible. The case officially remains open, with federal warrants still active for Paul and Foster. But investigators privately acknowledge that both men are likely dead, victims of the same greed and paranoia that had driven their partnership from the beginning. The money they stole has vanished as completely as they have, scattered through offshore accounts and investment vehicles that may never be recovered. In the end, the Flight 447 heist stands as a testament to both human ingenuity and human frailty. Paul and his accomplices had proven that even the most secure systems could be compromised by those with sufficient knowledge, patience, and determination. But they had also demonstrated that no crime, however perfectly executed, could remain hidden forever. Time has a way of exposing every secret, revealing every lie, and bringing every criminal scheme into the harsh light of justice. The weathered passport found in that Detroit storage unit served as more than evidence. It was a reminder that the past never truly disappears. It waits, patient and persistent, for the right moment to surface and demand an accounting. And in that accounting, the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how deeply it has been buried or how carefully it has been concealed.